Well, it's been 10 days since the polls closed in Venezuela on this year's presidential election. Incumbent President Nicolas Maduro was announced as the winner by the Central Election Board, and their verdict has been rejected by Washington and its allies in the region. Journalist Camila Escalante was in Venezuela for the election and only returned on Thursday to Nicaragua, witnessing what's happened in the country in the aftermath, and we spoke with her via Skype on Thursday. Well, Camila, you've been there since the election and just returning now to Nicaragua. What do you see in Venezuela, on the streets and on television and in the news, that's at odds with what they've been telling us, which, of course, is that Maduro lost the election. It's time for the PSUV to get over it and step out of the way and let democracy reign.
Well, the Chavistas are mobilizing in very large numbers, some days hundreds of thousands, other days tens of thousands of people. But essentially every day since the day that we saw that Guarimba violence and terrorism, which was these small armed groups, the opposition is calling them commandos, following the July 28th vote, they came out, those small armed groups, they carried out all those acts of vandalism. That is being shown in the media, of course, some arson, but some of the media is, of course, portraying them as peaceful protests. They're portraying them as political rallies and things like that. It's really not that. We've seen very few political rallies in favor of the opposition former candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, and Maria Corina Machado, who's this far-right figure who's really leading the opposition right now. But so they really haven't had the ability to mobilize very many people in the streets, neither in Caracas or the rest of the country. The recourse they do have is violence, and they've used it time and time again in previous years. On the other hand, the Chavistas have been mobilizing by sector, by community organizations, women, youth, and all sorts of other groups of people. Each day, they have been rounding up, rallying, and marching to the Miraflores, they say, in defense of their vote, in defense of the Bolivarian Revolutionary Project, and their elected president, Nicolas Maduro, and that government. They say they're not simply going to deliver power to the gringos only because their opposition puppets have come to say that they won the election. And they're saying that they won the election based on a website that they erected all of a sudden the weekend of the election, an election website that's probably being run by people in Miami and Washington, and it's simply not the official mechanism to be able to proclaim someone winner of an election. The electoral authority in Venezuela continues to be the National Electoral Council, the CNE, and also the Supreme Court has jurisdiction over this. And so what's happening right now, of course, on the exterior is all this clamoring from the far right of Latin America, figures like Javier Milei, the president of Argentina, Luis Lacalle Pou of Uruguay, Gabriel Boric, and the people they're in company with are saying that the opposition has won the election. Simply in no scenario in any election around the world do you have other governments proclaiming the winner of the election that is internal of a sovereign country. That just doesn't make any sense. No country is waiting for the State Department to declare a winner, and if they are, then that country, frankly, lacks independence and sovereignty and is just a protectorate or some sort of a territory. So the government says that we have to wait to see, what the final what the process is going to be internally, and that comes down to the CNE and the Supreme Court within Venezuela.
So, I remember when we went through this not so long ago, there was a different mechanism that was operating at the time, but the U.S. government interpreted Venezuela's constitution and law and the electoral regs as divesting President Maduro of the presidency and somehow vesting it in Juan Guaido. Under that theory, and he was recognized as the president of Venezuela by the United States and a host of other I would say other countries, anyway, other nations, the EU in particular, to the extent that major Venezuelan state assets were transferred in those jurisdictions under his signature. And yet, this past election, he was nowhere to be found. If he's the incumbent president, for some reason he decided not to run this time. And at the inauguration that comes up, certainly he's not going to be handing over power to anyone. So I'm wondering how they go from fantasy to fantasy and stitch these different, packages of fantasy together to make it look like one story.
Well, that's the question. I mean, anyone who's been following Venezuela knows that there's huge gaps that need to be stitched together. For one, as you said, Juan Guaido in May 2018 was an unknown person. He only became known in January of the following year, mid-January, when he decided to swear himself in as so-called president in this virtual reality that they exist in the middle of the street. But who ran in the election was about 4 opposition candidates, none of whom received very much of the vote count, and President Maduro ran for re-election that May 2018. None of the far-right candidates did. They all persuaded their followings to not participate in the election and to boycott them altogether. So certainly they didn't win. He was at the time, president of the former National Assembly, elected in 2015, but nobody knew who he was internationally or within the country. He's just another one of these opposition lawmakers, kind of random, but he was chosen because he had a relatively okay record and wasn't too controversial. But ultimately, the United States and all of these countries of the so-called Lima Group and those allied countries who decided to supposedly recognize his Narnia presidency, decided at some point in the last year or two that they would stop their recognition, that they did in some way or another recognize that there's no longer that old National Assembly doesn't have a permanent mandate, that its mandate had expired. And so neither was he elected in 2018 as president, nor was he the president of any National Assembly any longer. He was literally just a dude. And so they had to just say, okay, that whole thing is over. They also, they had like the United States had created all of these artificial parallel virtual government institutions. They even were trying to run their own parallel Supreme Court. So things got really confusing because if you were going by the international mainstream media, specifically the Colombian media, for example, you would be hearing them refer to an institution that doesn't really exist unless you're following closely on somebody's Twitter account when they made the fake institution. So that's what we're moving towards right now. It seems like that the United States hasn't really definitively said that they are themselves proclaiming Edmundo Gonzalez to be the new president-elect of Venezuela, but they say that he has won the greater number of votes in this election that necessary to be able to win, and that he should be the next president. And the other governments who do not comprise the international community, but are merely one small minority of the international community, that's what they're saying right now as well. So it's very likely that we're going to see this sort of a thing once again. We're in this weird postmodernist world of make-believe that they're going to have all sorts of parallel institutions, because at the end of the day, who runs the country and who's in power is, of course, who commands over the armed forces, the police, the different actual institutions in the country, and so forth, all of which have been controlled by the governing PSUV all of these years.
It's just fascinating that these proponents of rule of law don't acknowledge that they've created fragmented jurisdictions that in fact mean there is no law transcending the borders that they've created, and consequently no universal rule of law certainly that doesn't follow their diktat. Thank you very much, Camila, for your time. We're scratching our head up here trying to figure out what's actually going on from the story that they're telling us, and this helps a lot. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Don. Nice talking to you.
Same. For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.